Hello, everybody. Welcome to the special series on GS Mains 2019 discussion. As a part of this special series, we have been covering a number of questions that have appeared in the Mains examination 2019, which have been covered under the various sources we provide, including the Daily News Simplified, the monthly Focus magazine, and the Mains Compass that is released before the Mains examination in the corresponding year. In this edition, we will be discussing this question that appeared on General Studies paper 4 related to crisis of conscience for 10 marks. Now the question was fairly straightforward and read, what is meant by crisis of conscience? How does it manifest itself in the public domain? The question was asked for 10 marks and shall be written in 150 words. Now, before we discuss the answer to this question, let us look at the various sources that have covered the related topic. Now, this section was covered in the Mains Compass 2019 on page number 54 under the head Role of Conscience in Decision Making. Now, in this write up, the basics of conscience was covered as to what constitutes conscience, the development of conscience, conscience as a moral principle, and conscience is a source of ethical guidance, which is directly mentioned in the syllabus of General Studies paper 4. Now, I would like to reiterate that the objective of this special series is twofold. One is to highlight the importance of various sources we provide, including the Daily News Simplified analysis, the Focus monthly magazine, the Mains Compass, that are designed in a way to enable the students to collate the content that is required to answer a question in the mains examination. Besides, this series is also directed to build an approach towards answer writing in the mains examination. Thus, while the mains compass, as highlighted here, provides you sufficient content, now let us discuss this question in order to understand how to use this content in your answer writing. Now, as I have already mentioned, this question is fairly straightforward in that the examiner is demanding you to write what is meant by crisis of conscience. How does it manifest itself in the public domain? This answer shall be written in 150 words as it is for 10 marks. Now, since this is a straightforward question, the approach to write this answer will be fairly simple in that we need to define what is crisis of conscience to begin with and illustrate what is crisis of conscience as the examiner is looking for your understanding of crisis of conscience when he says what is meant by crisis of conscience. Moreover, in paper 4 in general, it is advisable to illustrate the concepts that you are highlighting as the examiner is looking for your understanding of the ethical concepts. So, defining and illustrating what is crisis of conscience will satisfy the first part of the question, which is what is meant by crisis of conscience. Once this is done, you may give examples as to how this crisis of conscience is manifested in the public domain, which is the demand of the second part of the question. Besides, since the question is asked only for 10 marks, I would suggest you to emphasize more on the illustrations and the examples that you provide, especially in the General Studies paper 4. Now, before we look into what is crisis of conscience, conscience of an individual is essentially the inner beliefs and convictions of what constitutes a morally right action and what constitutes a morally wrong action. Now, the root word of conscience is from a Latin word conscientia, which means with knowledge. Thus, conscience refers to that part of the individual which constitutes inner beliefs and convictions about what is morally right and wrong. Therefore, as it is clear, conscience is a source of ethical guidance for an individual. Now, since the inner beliefs and convictions of what constitutes right and wrong is confined to one's own self, it is essentially subjective in nature and is a character of an individual. Besides, an action that is based on conscience as a source of ethical guidance completely relies on the inner beliefs and convictions of an individual, and no role is played by any external factors in the ethical decision making. However, these inner beliefs and convictions are developed with the development of inner self of an individual, that is based on some source which we call as source of conscience. Now, the inner beliefs and convictions may be formed on the basis of personal experience of an individual or based on experience of others, which in other words we may term it as history. Besides, the group to which an individual belongs also plays a key role in the development of inner beliefs of a person, and these groups may be as small as a family and as big as a society. In addition, religious beliefs also act as a source of conscience, and there are certain universal values which appeal to everyone in general and plays an important part in the development of inner beliefs and convictions of an individual. However, conscience is essentially inward in nature in the sense that notwithstanding the influence of all these sources, what an individual believes with conviction is subjective in nature and may not be same for two different individuals even though the source of conscience is same. Now, crisis of conscience is a situation when an individual action is not in line with his or her inner beliefs and convictions, and thus an individual feels an action or a decision that is taken in contravention to his inner belief or conviction is not ethically tenable. In other words, crisis of conscience arises when an individual action or decision is not in line with his inner belief of what is right and wrong, and thus the decision or the action is not ethically tenable. Thus, under a state of crisis of conscience, an individual constantly keeps questioning his acts as immoral as they are not in line with his inner beliefs or convictions of what is right and what is wrong. Besides, a state of crisis of conscience is said to arise in an individual when there is a huge gap between what is called as an ideal self and real self. In that, while the beliefs of an individual constitutes what is called an ideal self, the actions of the individual is what that portrays his real self. Now, a mismatch between beliefs and actions, in other words, ideal self and real self, gives rise to a state of crisis of conscience in an individual. Now, coming to illustrations of a state of crisis of conscience. In situation 1, a child stealing a loaf of bread does not result in a state of crisis of conscience for the child. Now, this is because the beliefs of the child or the conscience of the child is not well developed and the child merely acts according to the situation. In this case, there is no repository of conscience for a child to guide the ethical behavior as the ideal self of the child is not well developed. As a result, a precondition for the state of crisis of conscience to occur, there has to be a mismatch between what is called as ideal self and real self. Since in this case, it has no benchmarks of inner belief or conviction to judge its action of stealing a bread and thus does not constitute a situation of crisis of conscience. Now, the next situation relates to a person whose ideal self is well developed and he constantly resorts to wastage of water. Now, at the time of wastage of water, there is no crisis of conscience for this individual, though his ideal self is well developed. But the moment he faces a crisis situation, as in shortage of water, he is reminded of the times when he wasted the water, questioning his acts of the past, leading to a state of crisis of conscience for that individual. Therefore, apart from the precondition of the mismatch between ideal self and real self, a trigger is necessary for a state of crisis of conscience to occur. Now, in this case, the trigger is a crisis situation the individual himself faces, or it could be a crisis situation that is faced by others. Now, essentially, situation 2, in which an individual wastes water despite the belief of the individual not to do so, gives rise to a state of crisis of conscience in the individual, especially when the inner beliefs and convictions are triggered. Now, while the first two situations related to individual conscience, the third situation relates to what is called as collective conscience of a particular section of the society. Now, the revival of the debate between religious freedom and constitutional morality in the Sabarimala case clearly depicts a state of crisis of conscience in which deeply embedded beliefs of liberty, equality, and fraternity that the Constitution prescribes is fighting with the practice of gender discrimination that is attributed to a particular religious belief. Now, having addressed the first part of the question by defining and illustrating the state of crisis of conscience, let us list down the manifestation of crisis of conscience in the public domain. Now, before we list down the manifestations of crisis of conscience in public domain, it is important to highlight that a society is said to undergo a crisis of collective conscience when there is a tussle between the underlying beliefs in the society and the happenings in the society at the time. Now, therefore, essentially, the crisis of conscience in public domain manifests itself in the form of civil society activism that was seen in Arab Spring, which was essentially a movement against authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, the anti-corruption movement of 2011 led by Anna Hazare in India, the Nirbhaya case, the Me Too movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement against the prevailing inequality in the society, and most recently the Hong Kong protest by the pro-democratic sections of the society. Now, in all such cases, the inner beliefs or the convictions of the society of gender equality, income equality, democracy, accountability, and transparency led to what is called as civil society activism, which is essentially a manifestation of crisis of conscience in these societies. Now, besides, crisis of conscience in the public domain also manifests in the form of religious reforms or even conversions in cases of some religions the moment that sections of that religious denomination starts questioning the practices like untouchability, sati, etc. Besides, crisis of conscience also manifests in the form of legal and constitutional reforms, as was seen in decriminalization of Section 377 recently, and also passing of the Triple Talaq bill recognizing the constitutional rights of Muslim women in India. Now, finally, crisis of conscience also manifests in the form of acknowledgement of historical wrongs, as in case of Galileo, under which the Vatican Church, which had sentenced Galileo for life for proposing the heliocentric model, finally apologized in 1992 after a gap of 350 years. Besides, in April 2019, the then Prime Minister of UK, Theresa May, acknowledged the fact that the Jallianwala Bagh massacre was a historical wrong and should not have occurred. Besides, you can positively conclude by saying that crisis of conscience in the public domain is a gateway for reforms, as we have mentioned here, and is a sign of progress for any society. With this, we come to the end of today's discussion. The model answer for the question is given in the PDF below.